The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 teachers in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with the Tennessee academic standards. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu. This video is aligned with the following Tennessee academic standards.
So one of the things that we're going to do is look at art. One of the reasons we're going to look at art is because art is something that's very easy to teach students to read. Because you don't need to know the language, and you can get pretty good at it pretty quickly. So I thought it might be a useful tool for you to kind of get an idea about. So today what we're going to talk about is maybe a little bit different side of ancient Egypt and a little bit more depth than maybe most of you are aware of. I am an Egyptologist. I've done archaeological projects in Egypt. I don't do those anymore because now I'm an associate dean, but I still have plenty of stuff to publish, and so I'm still involved in the field. And certainly if any of you are ever interested in having me come to your classes, I'd love to do that. I love talking to kids about this kind of stuff. I love talking to anyone. I love talking to the wall about ancient Egypt. So one of the things that's really, really important for all early civilizations, and Egypt included, is that religion plays a part in everything. And we're not just talking about, oh yeah, I know who Osiris is, and I've taught Sunday school with 6th graders, and they love to be like, have you heard of Osiris? Have you heard of this? And sometimes they'll throw in one that they think I've never heard of. And they love that stuff. But there's a lot more to it than the gods and mummies and that kind of stuff. And it really affects everything. When I teach history classes here at MTSU, I always start by saying, you cannot study ancient Egyptian history without understanding the religion behind it, because it's such an integral part. And so what I wanted to do today, with some going in depth in side notes, here and there, some things that I wanted to share with you, is to kind of talk about the basics of ancient Egyptian religion, how that affects kingship, and why it's so stable for so long, right? Because you can look at an image of a king from before ancient Egypt was a state, and then you can look at Cleopatra and everything in between, and there are things that are immediately recognizable all throughout that. And we're talking about thousands of years of history, like 3,000 years of history almost, where we can really identify things from the start to the finish. So that means that ancient Egypt is a very conservative society. It doesn't change a whole lot. I mean, it does, but it does it in specific ways. And so what we're going to do is kind of look at what it takes to change things in ancient Egyptian society, and some sort of models for that, and then some questions that brings us. So the first thing is the key concepts, which are Maat and Isfet. Okay, so Maat it means something, it doesn't have an exact English equivalent, but it's something along the lines of order, justice, everything going the way it should go. And then the opposite of that is Isfet. Isfet is disorder, disjustice, those kinds of things. So the Egyptians believed that these two entities were both a part of, the world. And they believed that they didn't see it as good versus evil. It wasn't like the Egyptians were there to drive out all Isfet. They believed there was a balance. And the proper balance, it was the role of the king to maintain that balance. Right? So Isfet can be associated with foreigners. But if we look at this top image, we can see a planting scene. So this is something from Egypt. Egyptians were the center of the universe to Egyptians, right? And so they were the right way, the way it should be. Okay, so they depict themselves, especially in funerary kinds of contexts, as being that order. And then if we look at the other, this is an image from Ramses III when he was fighting against the Sea Peoples. And you'll see that the Egyptians are shown very orderly. And the foreigners are shown with their body parts sprawled everywhere, right? And that's to depict Isfet. And so what the king is doing here is he is working his job to maintain, that Maat in Egypt and kind of drive the Isfet to the borders. Okay, not to eliminate them, but to put them where they belong. All right, so Maat and Isfet are key to understanding ancient Egypt completely, because they are the main concepts around which the society functioned and the way that they viewed the king's role and the way that they saw themselves within the greater world itself. So one of the things that we're going to do is look at art, as I told you before, because art will often really show the differences between Maat and Isfet. So if you look at this image is from around 3000 BCE. The writing was just getting started. So we don't have a verbal system or anything like that. We don't have grammar. We just have labels. And the Narmer palette is one of the first images that most people kind of recognize when they start to talk about ancient Egyptian history from the beginning. So in here, what are some examples of Maat that you can see?
On the left, kind of like a leadership role and a subservient role.
Okay, good. And this is like you're looking at both sides at the same time. So you're looking at the front and the back at the same time. That's why there's two images there. It's actually one object.
With the symmetrical layout, like bilateral symmetry, this is part of that as well.
Good. Okay. And what would be Isfet?
Little guys on the bottom on the left.
Okay. They're conquered enemies that are all, their bodies are broken up. Right, good. And we have a taming of a beast. That's actually more of a Mesopotamian / ancient Elam thing than is Egyptian. It falls out because it's not really part of the culture. But we get some of those things early on because there's some cross influence there. All right, good. All right, so let's move away from that and let's just look at this object and how we might be able to understand something about ancient Egyptian history and society from looking at this. All right, so now we need to go, I tell my students to look at it like a second grader, kindergartner. Really basic stuff. So what are some observations that you have? Some of them you've already had, but...
The bird.
Right, so that's probably an early version of Horus, associated with kingship very early, but more of a solar deity at this point than what we come to know him as later. What else?
The bowling pin hat.
Oh, good. The bowling pin hat. That is the crown of Upper Egypt. Okay, so we've got the crown of Upper Egypt. What later becomes that? We don't really know what it means now. Okay, what else?
The cows that have human faces on the top.
Okay, so those may be early versions of Hathor, a goddess, a cow goddess. She goes way back, so it's very likely. What else do we have? Okay, so someone said that, look at the size of the guy with the bowling pin. You notice anything about him? Right, he's bigger, right? So that's showing his status compared to everyone else. Right, he's the king. He's up here, everyone else down here. Okay, so we can see society being reflected in this object.
But the guy that seems in front of him has the same proportions.
Right, so he's probably the leader of the bad guys or whoever these guys are. The unfortunate conquered foe. Right, so something that's important to understand when we're looking at this, we're obviously looking at him conquering someone. And if you look on the other one, the other side, can you see what those are?
Are they bodies?
Yes, and their heads are between their legs. So they're decapitated. So they're laid out so they can count them. All right, so we have conquering scenes. And on this side, the big guy is wearing a different crown. And that's the crown of Lower Egypt later on, or maybe now. So what do you think that this object, what does it say? If we combine those two messages, what do we have?
The same guy is wearing two hats.
Yeah, so he's the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Right, Narmer was probably right around the time of unification, We have a little debate on who exactly unified Egypt first, but he was either right before, right after, during, he's sometime around there. And what you need to know is that when Egyptians talk about battles or just about anything in literature or art, it's a formula. They're not actually saying this is the event. What they're saying is, this is what a king does. And of course, Narmer would do this because he's a king. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he's the one who did any of this. What it means is that he's fitting into that idea of the king maintaining Maat, defeating Isfet. And that's what everything is always about. So we can't take a text from ancient Egypt and just look at it and say, oh yeah, this is telling us a historical event. It's much trickier than that with ancient cultures, with very ancient cultures, pre-classical cultures. Okay, we can't take them at face value. We have to understand them within their context and within what the people who wrote them intended. And it's a very different thing than in our society and what we're used to.
So this would not necessarily be a narrative, where Narmer starts out as king of Upper Egypt. Presumably, when you flip the stone, he has defeated them on the battlefield, and afterwards he's in a parade to look at the dead body, look at the executed.
It doesn't mean that he did this. It's not a specific event. It's a formula. It's a formula for kingship.
So we shouldn't teach this, say, as a before and after picture.
No, actually, I think they're meant to go together. And also, it's very complicated because it wasn't really Upper and Lower Egypt. It was like 3 different places in Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt was kind of doing something different at this time and kind of got conjoined, but it's not like this. But then later on, this narrative of Upper and Lower Egypt really comes into play, and then we can't read that back into this.
If you're looking at this, are you reading it from what I would see the right side is probably the back, maybe?
There's no way to look at this as one.
Be able to tell.
No. The other thing is that it's important to know that this object was like, it was found in a special deposit from an ancient temple, the ancient temple of Horus at Hyrcanopolis. So it was a sacred object in a temple. It wasn't, oh, let's write this down for history. It was a sacred object to reinforce this idea of the king and order and that kind of thing. And so it has other objects in there too, which are also really fascinating, that were deposited. It's wonderful that we have this deposit of these fantastic art objects. But we have to learn how to look at them and how to use them properly. And it's difficult. But the good thing is that students can learn to do this, at least to make some arguments or to see the issues involved without very much training. Because it's meant to just be interpreted from literate, illiterate, it doesn't really matter. Most of ancient Egypt was not literate. So the images convey a lot. And if we can learn how to interpret those, we can get a lot of information. All right, so I wanted to see if I had a volunteer who could sit like that. We see that position in ancient Egyptian art all the time. Anyone want to give it a try?
Do we get help getting out of that?
Right. I mean, it's like the whole walk like an Egyptian thing, right? Okay, does anyone know why they're depicted these ways?
It's called frontalism.
Okay, but there's a religious reason as well. Okay, so actually, yeah.
Doesn't it have to do with all of you giving to the outer?
Yes, it does. So this is what this is actually depicting. Like crisscross applesauce. I have young children, right? It's a scribal position is what it is. And so the idea is that there are certain body parts that need to be shown in certain ways. In fact, that's true of all of the art. So everything falls within a convention of how it must be shown so that it is most complete or most recognizable. Okay, so with a person, we want to be able to see both legs, both arms. You only see one eye, but you see the complete eye, right, from the side, which is not natural, right? I mean, it's a convention. But the idea is that the Egyptians wanted it to be most identifiable and most recognizable, because art, as well as writing, is magical. It has magical qualities. And so if you're depicting someone, you want them to be whole, that the universe remembers them as whole and they will stay whole in the afterlife, or that's just the way things need to be. And so we get that with other things as well. All right, so here we have things from several different time periods. But here we have these sort of famous New Kingdom ladies at a party, right? So how do you think we're supposed to see them in relationship to each other?
Is there a precedence going on here? One of them is taking precedence. She's in front.
Yeah, there's this artist actually is known in the Luxor region. They've been able to identify several tombs that he did, he painted, and he actually went against the conventions here and there. So you have the one looking the opposite direction, which is not what we would consider normal. He also has one where you see this girl's face frontally. It's like he was experimenting with things that weren't supposed to be done. And it's one guy, the art historians can identify his hand, and they know it's one person. But what I'm looking at is the relationship, because we also have it here in this one as well, where they're sort of depicted one in front of the other.
I think it means like hierarchy within people, but.
Okay. What it actually is, they're actually.
But okay, so are you asking us like if we were going to realistically depict the arrangement?
Like, what is this actually depicting in real life?
They'd be sitting in a circle or square, like facing each other.
They would actually be sitting next to each other. But you have to show all of their arms and legs. So you have to spread them out like this in order to be able to do that, right? And each individual needs to be recognizable as an individual. So in this one, I mean, you can see all the girls that way. In the other image, it's actually a woman with two different men who are both her husbands, but not at the same time. One of them died and she remarried. But she has them both depicted on here. And her arm starts here and ends over here. It's like behind them all. But it still needs to be there, right? Even though it's not really matching with everything. But you can start to see how you might be able to look at these things. The other thing in this object here, which I know is hard for you to see unless you're close to one of these monitors, here we have an offering table, and it's piled high with offerings, right? It's actually showing everything on the table, but it's putting them up so that we can identify each individual object. And they're all drawn within convention as well, how they are drawn within that convention to make them most identifiable. All right, and then finally, I'll just show you one last one. I know this one is also very difficult to see without being able to blow it up more. But if you look, there's lots of things here. There's lots of situations where people are actually side by side, the same kinds of things we've been seeing. There's some people who are higher rank. They're shown as being bigger than the other people. And we also have a garden scene here. So that T, you see the T? That's a pool. And the trees are shown in the same, like they're shown in the same way for both sides of it. But what we're really seeing is, a pool lined with trees. So you start to see how you might be able to figure out how you're supposed to see these things. Because they do depict real things, but they're depicting them in a way that the Egyptians found to be proper. Okay? And part of that is backed up by their religion and the fact that these things need to be shown in the most recognizable way. Because if you're dead and you have you've gone to the afterlife and your family forgets to bring you offerings, you want to make sure that those are provided. And so they need to be recognizable for that to occur magically. That's what it comes down to. Yeah.
So they have rules for art almost as if we would have rules for, drawing like an architectural diagram. Mm-hmm. In other words, their rules are you have to do it this way because this is the proper way, not our way of art, which is very individual.
No. In fact, they would take a wall, they would draw a grid, and they've set proportions for each of these things. And the proportions change slightly over time, but very slightly. So you can see, I mean, it wasn't one person. They had one person who drew the grid lines. They had a master who came in and kind of, outlined what was going to go on there. And then they had kind of the lackeys who came up and finished everything. And then the master would come back, and if it was wrong, they would correct it. And sometimes we can see evidence of that they corrected it. Like if they had to chisel it in, like they were actually doing relief, and it was wrong, they would plaster it back in, and then they would re-chisel it. And then in our times, it falls out, and it becomes the helicopter, right? That you see on the History Channel. I guess you guys didn't see that documentary. That's Abydos, the place where I work, and yeah, I've gone and looked at it, and I don't believe they had helicopters. I really don't. But I'll let you know if they're discovered. Yeah.
To go back to this idea of religious belief, and so that when they're making art, especially in a place like a tomb, they aren't showing us kind of like scenes from the life of whoever's buried there.
Yeah.
What they're actually trying to do is trying to create, I mean, should we think of this as like, this is the way you should live a life? Like it's kind of like a template?
Yeah, so there's a British scholar named John Baines, and he looked at sort of ethics in ancient Egypt, and we can draw some of that out of these things. There's actually funerary texts within the coffin texts, and then later on within the Book of the Dead, which have they're called the negative confessions. So it's like, yeah, I didn't do this, I fed the and then the positive ones. I fed the hungry, I clothed the naked, I took care of the orphans. They're formulas, right? You picked and chose which ones you wanted in your tomb. So do you know this scene? I know it's small, but do you know that scene? The judgment scene, it's the judgment from the Book of the Dead. Okay, so this is the scene where the person is judged, right? What a great person, let's let them into the afterlife. But that's not what this is. This is actually a cheat sheet. It's a spell, and we have precedents for it in the coffin texts, which come before the pyramid texts. The coffin texts are like Middle Kingdom, like dynasties 11, 12, 13, those periods. So in there, everybody chose this one, right? The Book of the Dead, you could choose which parts you want. They always go in the same order, but you can pick and choose. This one's always in there because the judgment scene is really important. Not because people just liked it, but because it was necessary. And so when you were asked the question by Osiris, you have to say set things. Very set things. So those are the things that are like, I fed the hungry, I did all this stuff. It doesn't matter whether you did or not. All that matters is that in that specific spot, when you were there, you say the right stuff, that you have the right words, and this gives you those words. Okay, so that's where it gets tricky because people think, oh, the judgment scene, it's about being a good person, it's about this, it's about that. It has nothing to do with that. It's all about magic, and if you know the right things to say. Earlier in the Middle Kingdom, you also had to know the names of the doors and the bolts and the everything, and you had cheat sheets for all of that. It was on your coffin, though. So if we trace it back to the Old Kingdom where you see all of those images of daily life, what do you think that means? Is that really it's like a photograph of that person's life? Or is it the formula to get them to the afterlife? Also, a lot of those have to do with offerings, right? It's the making of products, the making of jewelry, the making of food, so that the person will have those things in the afterlife. In case their relatives don't follow through like they're supposed to and give them their offerings. I mean, it's a backup system. It's an insurance policy. That's all it is. They spent a lot on the insurance policy because they didn't have a lot of faith in those ancestors, those descendants following through with the offerings.
What if you couldn't afford to have this done?
That's a good question, right? Because in Egypt, what happened was, of course, the Nile flooded every year, and the soil would cover over everything, and it covered over most of those cemeteries for the poor people. We don't really know about their system. The system I'm talking about here is your top 1% to 2% of the population. When we talk about ancient Egypt, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the regular people. You know how everybody always thinks they were an Egyptian in a previous life? And it's always like a king or queen. More than likely, you worked in the fields, right? Just statistically. So as I was saying, when we look at texts and art, because a lot of times they're together, especially on a temple wall like this one, we have to understand the context of those texts. Okay? Otherwise, we have no idea whether that's history in our view or whether it's something different. Okay, so maybe you've heard of the Battle of Kadesh of Ramses II. He fought a battle with the Hittites, the Hatti. Okay, the Hittites, fascinating civilization, very powerful. Lots of new archaeological data coming out about them. All of their names sound like you're trying to spit up something. So, it's always fun to try those out. But Ramses II had this giant battle in what today would be Syria. Somewhere in that, the exact location is not 100% known. But they had this giant confrontation with the Hittites. So this was like World War negative 550, right? It was big. Like this would have been a horrendous place to be, at this battle. So Ramses puts information about this battle, including these wonderful scenes where you can really start to try to track what happened during the battle, along with two different types of text. One of them is called the poem, because it actually is poetry, and the other one is more of a narrative. And he put it 3 different temples, at Karnak, at the Ramesseum, and at Abu Simbel. So it's 3 of his major temples, one of them even outside of Egypt. And so we have these, and so basically what happens is the Egyptians make a terrible tactical mistake. They let in spies who tell them the wrong thing, right? And then, so they're like, okay, well, let's go get them. It was a trap. And they fell right into the trap. And they fell into disarray. And not only that, they didn't even have all their army there yet. I mean, it was a mess. Like Egyptians didn't write things that were negative, especially on temple walls. Right, so he had to spin it, right? So he spins it and that he is able to come and save the day, and Ramses comes in and he whips everyone into shape, and because of him and maybe some gods, he wins. And that's what he says. He says he wins, right? And on the temple wall of Karnak, they actually put up a treaty. They have the Egyptian version of the treaty. It says the Egyptians won. So that's the way everyone said it. The Egyptians won. Egyptians won. Okay, so the Egyptians won. Then they were doing archaeology about a decade ago in the capital of the Hittites. And they found a treaty from this battle. And guess who they said won?
We won.
The Hittites won. So now we get there, it must have been a draw. No, it's not. It didn't matter who won. For the Egyptians, when they put something on a temple wall, it has to fit into that Maat Isfet thing. And so Ramses has to say that he won because this is a temple. And that's how it becomes. It becomes the reality, whether it was the reality in our view or not. That is their reality. If it's on the temple wall and that's what it says, that's how it's remembered and that's how it occurred. Doesn't matter what actually happened. The other thing is it's a formula, because we also have an earlier one, the Battle of Megiddo, Tutmosis III, same general components. So this also fits within a formula.
This is very early propaganda in a sense.
But it's not propaganda to gain any sort of political gain. It's propaganda for the gods, right? It's propaganda to make sure the universe continues. That's important.
But could he lose his title as pharaoh if his people see it as losing balance? And like if you look at the Chinese mandate of heaven, I mean, is that?
It's masked in Egypt to the point you can barely find that any of that stuff happens. But of course we know, just logically, and we know that some pharaohs were offed, or at least the attempt was made, because we have records of the trials of the people who tried to kill them. So we know that happens sometimes. But this is a cosmic level thing. It's not a political thing. All right, so that brings us to hieroglyphs. So I already said that hieroglyphs are a form that's magical. Okay, so the Egyptians actually called them hieroglyphs Medu Neter. That was their word for them. So Medu Neter means words of the gods. So that already tells you there's something special about the script. Now obviously these are the ones that fit with our alphabet, totally not the order the Egyptians put them in. They actually did have an order, but they don't just have these signs. They didn't have an alphabetic script. They had one that has like several hundred signs, some of which have more than one sound involved in them. 1, 2, 3 are the commonest, and then there's also like 4 and 5 and some ridiculous ones that are quite rare. But one of the things about hieroglyphs is that in certain time periods, such as in the pyramid texts, in the pyramid age, they actually, if they were too close to the sarcophagus, where the mummy of the king was, or even an elite, they had to make sure that that image couldn't come alive and harm the mummy. So I have some examples here at the top. So here the bee doesn't have its head. The snake, the viper, the one that goes and is like the VF sound, doesn't have its tail, so it can't jump, because they jump for the jugular. The ducks don't have their feet, so it makes them harmless. Some of them even have daggers in them, right, just to make sure that they can't harm the mummy. Right, this for them was not a silly thing. It was a very real thing, that in these really magical kinds of environments, tombs and temples, that hieroglyphs could actually come to life, that they were something about them that was so magically and religiously charged that things like that could happen, right? So if we back up and we say, okay, the types of things that are written in hieroglyphs, they're probably special, right? So we go back and we look at Karnak. So what does that tell you about the text? Right, this is written in hieroglyphs. So are they going to put something there that,
could come true?
Right. It's magically charged, right? So anything that's in hieroglyphs, anything that's located in a tomb or a temple or anything religiously charged is put there deliberately and carefully. And the content is screened to make sure it's not going to harm that whole concept of Maat versus Isfet. It's also there to make sure that, again, the king was, the Maat Isfet thing is all about the universe existing, the sun coming up each day. All of that was extremely important, right? It's important now, but we view it in a different way. Yeah?
Since these are put on by the 1% to 2%, it's part of the reason for the magical, because the common, ordinary person may not have known the meanings behind them. They just knew that they couldn't read them, like maybe people traditionally haven't been literate in the language either.
The context of hieroglyphs, where hieroglyphs were written, common people would not have seen them hardly ever. They might come into contact with them occasionally, but most people would never have entered a temple, ever. Because they had them, like, they had a symbol for them on the wall. Bird with its wings clipped behind its back, worshiping. That represented the common people. They didn't need to be there. They were represented in the wall. All right, so hieroglyphs, and it's not hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphic is an adjective. Hieroglyphs is a noun. So there are hieroglyphs. And they had the rebus principle, so they are based on sound. People used to think you could go, oh, it's a box and a feather, and what does that mean? It's not that. It's actually taking the signs and making them true sounds and putting things together that are abstract. So here, what do we have? Belief. So we have a bee and a leaf, and that makes belief, which has nothing to do with a bee or a leaf. And that's how these systems start, and then they just become incredibly complicated. And so there were schools to teach the scribes how to write this stuff, how to read this stuff. And it took many years. And they have stay-in-school messages, which are my favorites. So So the way that students learn this, it appears that they just copy text over and over and over. And that's why we have copies of some of their literature, is because there were hundreds of copies of these things originally. And so some of them have made it to us. Okay, so basically some of the texts that they did was basically saying how bad other professions were. So the washerman's day is going up, going down. All his limbs are weak from whitening his neighbor's clothes every day, from washing their linen. The maker of pots is smeared with soil, like one whose relations have died. His hands, his feet are full of clay. He is like one who lives in the bog. And then, they have some that, like the merchant. Oh, that sounds exciting, right? You can just see these students being like, oh, I'd rather be out there doing what they're doing. That sounds much more exciting. The merchants travel downstream and upstream. They are busy as can be, carrying goods from one town to the other. They supply him who has wants, but the tax collectors carry off the gold, the most precious of metals. Right? So they would copy these things to reinforce that they should stay in school. And then they also did, of course, many other texts. All right, we'll skip Tutankhamun. So hieroglyphs are not the only script that was used in ancient Egypt. So what was used during most of ancient Egypt was hieratic. So those would have been accounts, sort of fictional stories, all of that kind of stuff, contracts, records of legal processes, like your normal day-to-day stuff that was not religiously charged was written in hieratic. On papyrus or on ostrakhan, which are pieces of rock or pottery. So like that's a really fancy one. Sometimes it's like a piece of rock like this big with a couple letters on it. Sometimes it's more. It just depends. But papyrus was extremely expensive, so it was not used, and they would use it over and over again. So sometimes you get papyrus with like text on the front and the back and crossed out and it faded and they just wrote something over it because it was so expensive. As time went on, later on, once we get to the late period into the Ptolemaic period, we have a script and a grammar called Demotic. And so you can see it comes from hieratic. And then after that, we get Coptic, which is when Greek letters came into Egypt. And basically, they needed a couple extra letters, so they added like 4 for their sounds. But it's basically Greek letters with some extra ones. And it was used to write the Coptic grammar. So when we say hieroglyphs, that's a very small percentage of what was actually written, and it's a very specialized type of writing for special areas. It wasn't like people would just sit there and write on papyrus and hieroglyphs. They would do the cursive, basically.
Which one is the third language on the Rosetta Stone? Is it hieratic or Demotic?
It's Demotic.
So like they were able to decipher the inscription because there was the Greek text that they could read, there were the hieroglyphs that they could not read, and then the Demotic
in between,
kind of bridged.
Yeah, that's correct. And hieroglyphs is not the grammar. The grammar is called Late, Middle, and Old Egyptian. So it's confusing to people a lot of times. So here we have the Great Pyramid of Giza, which was built by Khufu. In some of your textbooks, it's probably Cheops, but that's the Greekified version. And I like the Egyptians to be called what they call themselves, so Khufu is the actual Egyptian name for him. And so Khufu built the biggest pyramid ever built, right? Amazing. His sons looks taller, but that's just because he cheated and built it on a little hill to make it look taller. So he builds this great pyramid, and this is the entire area. Okay, so these are all tombs of officials who were all family members, because in that Old Kingdom time, they like to keep it under control, right? So you make sure it's all your family members, you don't let the power outside of the family. So if we look at this, so this is a plan, okay? So we're looking like down on this. It's basically like an architectural kind of drawing, an archaeological drawing. So what do you notice? So the pyramid has got the X through it. That's the convention for when we draw these things to put a square with an X through it, that means pyramid. Right, so what are some of the things that you can notice about this situation?
Slotted out.
Okay, it's extremely organized. Good.
There's stair step. They're kind of, it's like order maybe.
Okay. Okay, good. Good. There's actually streets. They're lined up along streets. Okay, what else? Has anyone ever been to Giza?
Is it near the water? I can't tell this.
Oh, that's where the cliff drops off. Yeah. Now there's like some pitiful horses that people can rent down the hill. It's amazing. These things are so big. I almost fainted the first time I saw them. It was just incredible. They're amazing.
What are those little boxes to the left of the top pyramid?
Okay.
Are buildings or graves?
Yeah, I mean, there are other tombs of the officials.
They're oriented north-south,
Okay, good. So they're oriented north-south. Good.
except for that causeway.
Yeah. That goes from the temple of Khafra, but that's Khafra. That's the sun. We're ignoring him. That goes down to the Sphinx. Yeah, that goes down to the Sphinx. And the reason it's oriented differently is because the terrain is a little difficult there, and that was, I guess, the best way they could line it up. All right, so what do you notice about the size of the square with the X through it, the pyramid, in relationship to the other things?
It's huge. It's very large.
Okay, so what does that tell us about Khufu and his power? Yeah. I mean, it took him like 20 years, 22 years to build this thing, right? You know, the stones are like the size of a car. I mean, that's no small thing. He had so much power. And part of what he did for his funerary complex is to portray that in stone for eternity. Right? He wants us to get a message from this. He wants us to see that his government was organized, that there were people who were more powerful and people who were less powerful, but he had them all organized. And it's reflective of his government and his capital city. Okay. The irony is that this is the only image we have of Khufu. It's this tall. He would be so mad. But at least we still remember his name, right? So Egyptians had temples in every major town to some god or goddess. All right, so they didn't all worship one god as the main one. So if you were from some village, you would worship primarily the god from your area, not necessarily other ones. So that means what ends up happening is that every god has, or goddess, has its own creation myth. And they contradict each other. Now, on the state level, they kind of eat each other up. It's like, oh, this happened. But before that, this happened. And then before that, this happened. But it doesn't seem to bother the ancient Egyptians that some of these stories contradict one another. They don't seem to question things in the way that we kind of do. It just was, and that was fine. But every god or goddess was responsible for maintaining Maat, for the regeneration of the universe every day with the rising of the sun. All of them play into that, but all kind of at the same time in kind of similar but yet different ways. Some of the creation myths would not be appropriate for your students necessarily in their content, but there are some that are okay. So in this particular one, we have Nun, which is the watery abyss, and that's what existed first. And then from that emerges a little plot of land, and then from that emerges a lotus. So the land is called Tatenin, the lotus is called Nefertum, and then the sun god appears in that lotus and is born out of that lotus, and then that's how life begins. Now, what's interesting about that is that it's actually replicating what happened with the inundation. So with the inundation, the water spreads over the land. As the water would recede, little plots of land would start to emerge, and all the little frogs and lizards and snakes would gather on those. So to the Egyptians, it was like replicating what happened and how life was generated. So it makes a lot of sense, really. And then that becomes an idea for things like a pyramid. A pyramid is supposed to be that original mound of earth off of which, the king could be regenerated into the afterlife. In this image here, this is Tutankhamun, and it shows his head on the top of the lotus. So it's him being reborn, just like the original creation of the earth.
Could those different gods and goddesses travel the way the Greeks envisioned their gods traveled? Yeah, but if I remember correctly, like the ancient Greeks, when they traveled to a place around the Mediterranean, they would see like a sun god and then say, oh, this is the Helios of such and such place. Do the Egyptians, like when they travel from one end of the mount to the other, do they take their gods with them?
They would take a god with them. They would set up a shrine to that particular god. They would acknowledge other people's gods, but they were not their gods. The Greeks went around and tried to equate all the gods. And they caused a lot of trouble for ancient Egypt, for the study of ancient Egypt, because the older scholarship tries to do that as well, and it doesn't. These gods are way older than the Greek gods. Way older. They were first. My gods were first.
But when they do that, but if you have, like, when the state gets involved, when Pharaoh gets involved, and you have some kind of festival where part of the Pharaoh's job is to be part of that, everyone, like, even if you're, Ammon of the Sticks isn't associated with that, it's still a festival day, so you drop what you're doing and you go take part in it. In other words, it's still communal, it's still a social thing.
Yes, for certain festivals, they were, like the kings occasionally had what's called a Sed festival, and then all of the major gods throughout the country would come, and they would exchange gifts and all that kind of stuff. And so there's very much that sort of social kind of thing. But you
never have someone, an ancient Egyptian, saying, "I'm not going," like that's for that's a Horus festival, and we were.
No, but certain festivals included certain gods. They didn't all include all of the gods.
Did they acknowledge the other gods for different places?
Yeah, yeah. But that would be your god, not my god. Right, my god would be the one from my home province.
It would be equivalent to Athena being more worshipped in Athens, more so than other places.
The thing where it gets tricky is that we have local gods, but we also have national gods, and the national gods is where you get a lot more sort of throughout. But it doesn't mean that everyone's worshiping that god. It just means that that's the god who's being given credit for military battles, for the state level kinds of things. And then the other gods kind of fit in around that. And they change over time occasionally. So temples, as I said before, were all about the regeneration of creation. And so I'm sure you're aware of pylons. So we have the pylon here with this gap in it, and they're lined up so that the sun will appear right here, and that's supposed to be like the horizon, the sun coming up. So basically the sun is being regenerated every day in every temple, in theory. Okay, so even temples are not just built to be nice and pretty, they're built for very specific reasons and very specific ways. And this is just so the Egyptians would go into, they'd go further south in Africa, and they'd see baboons. There were no baboons in Egypt. And baboons, when the sun comes up, put their hands up. I don't know if it's warm and they like that or what, but they do that. The Egyptians saw that as them worshiping the sun. And so a lot of times in temples, right by where the pylon is, you'll have images of baboons. So, because they're worshiping the sun as the sun comes up. And this all ties together for the Egyptians. This is kind of fun. So the Egyptians believed in the spirit, but we call it the personality. And it's made up of multiple parts. So they didn't say, oh, we have a soul. They said, oh, we have all these different parts, and they do different things. So one of the parts is the ka, and the ka is the double, right? And it really comes into play when a person dies. And the ka is the one that the offerings go to. It needs nourishment. So in a false door of an Old Kingdom tomb, we have a statue of a person coming. That's what the ka is supposed to inhabit. And if you had a statue of a god, it would be the god's ka that would come into that statue. And that's what you're giving the offerings to. The ka is also something that ties into kingship. So there was this idea of a royal ka. So there was this spirit. And that spirit would be joined with the mortal king, the person inhabiting the kingship, during the coronation. So that means that you could be king, and when you died, that spirit would still exist, and then we could have a coronation, and then you could become king. And then we'd have, you would die, and then we'd have another coronation, you would become king. So because that ka belongs to every king throughout ancient Egyptian history, that means if you conquered the Hittites, and I'm you, I can say that I conquered the Hittites. Because there's an aspect of the king that did all of the things of the predecessors. Does that make sense?
So that's why they went and chiseled off the old pharaoh's name and put their name up in their place.
Yeah. Like Hatshepsut says that she conquered the Hyksos. It was like 200 years later, But that gives her she had issues anyways because she was a woman. But that would give succeeding kings the right to do that, and it's perfectly fine.
I think I recall it was maybe in a National Geographic magazine that most of Ramses II's building projects were actually him sending the sculptors out, and they were just refacing the pharaoh's names.
Right. So the fun thing is that Ramses III, who was much later, like Ramses II is 19th dynasty, Ramses III is 20th dynasty. He was like the last great pharaoh of Egypt. So when he idolized Ramses II, he actually named his children in the same order. So it's really confusing for a while until we figure out like who's who. But when he inscribed his name into his funerary monument, he put it this deep. There is nobody gonna take credit for what he did.
So could the ka be passed, you said, from person to person?
Just as a king.
Just as a king. Would it only be passed through your family, or could it be passed to anybody that's taking that position?
Okay, anyone who made it to the coronation and became king was legitimate because that happened.
So it wouldn't necessarily have to be related?
No. It allows for, fuzzy things to happen. So it's useful for some people. All right, let me go through the rest of the personality and then I'll quit. All right, so the second part of the personality is the ba. The ba is the movable part of the soul. But it needs the mummy in order to come back to. So it stays with the mummy, and then it flies out and flitters all over the place. It might even visit its living relatives, or maybe carry out curses, or whatever it needs to do. And then it goes back to the mummy. If the mummy goes poof, it goes poof too. Okay, so it has to have something to return to.
Not like Ghost Saber.
Kind of. But the Egyptians really, and still today, believe in this sort of connection with the dead. It's not like the dead are over here and the living are over here. There's some areas where they can't overlap. Okay, then we have the Ak, which is the part that goes through that Osiris thing and gets promoted into the afterlife. Okay? So the fun thing about this is if you get killed by a crocodile or hippopotamus, you get a promotion when you become an Ak. You actually get a bump in status. So,
These people didn't live in reality.
They lived in their own reality. I think we all do that, if we're honest. All right, so these are other parts of the personality. The mummy, of course, was very important that it's recognizable. So, you would want your mummy to be high quality. Some people's mummies are not high quality at all. Ramses, of course, he looks like he could just wake up and start talking to us. So his is very high quality. So it's like sort of the pinnacle of what we would want in a mummy. But then they would have mummy masks. Of course, Tutankhamun has the fancy gold one. Not everyone had that. Sometimes they're painted or things like that. But there had to be some form of you that was recognizable so your ba could go back and forth. So when you're a tomb robber, you go in and you burn the mummy. That way the ba can't come and get you and cause problems for you, like no children and those kinds of things. And also the shadow. The shadow is kind of weird. Like it's a part of you. You might notice it when you go outside. It's always like trailing you or in front of you, right? So that must be some part of you, right? So the Egyptians incorporated that as well as this thing that when you die, it could actually kind of go off on its own. So, and then the other part is your name. Your name would need to be remembered. Now, the interesting thing is that some of the pharaohs that we know the most about, like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, are people who did things that were not, the Egyptians tried to erase them. And what they would do is like tear down their monuments and put them inside of their own monuments. And then that just preserved them better, right? So when we say Akhenaten, when we say Hatshepsut, that's not what they wanted us to do. But that's a part of that sort of memory of something is something that helps keep it alive, which I think makes sense to some degree as well.